What's your name?
My name is Eugene Skeef.
Can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I was born and brought up in South Africa. I live in Clapham in London, and I've been here for just under 31 years. It's about to be 31 years. I was born in a city called Durban, in a township called Ndunduma, which means Thundering Hills. And that's in the town of Durban, which is on the east coast by the Indian Ocean in South Africa.
What is your art about?
I'm mainly a composer and a percussionist. I'm a writer, I'm a poet, I'm working on a novel. I write chronicles, I'm a storyteller, I create stories for adults and children. I compose soundtracks for films. And I work with dancers, so I'm kind of involved in all the art forms. And I should mention that because I come from South Africa, I come from Africa, where the art forms are less compartmentalized than they are in the West. It's like in the West, normally you're either a painter or a photographer or a dancer, and even at that, you're a classical dancer or a contemporary dancer or a jazz dancer or a Kathak dancer, But the culture that I come from, there aren't that many barriers, there aren't walls between the various art forms. And I was brought up in a very dynamic community that led to me being inspired by, all the sounds and the creative life that surrounded me. And I grew up in a home where both my mother and father had been musicians. And my home was in a very violent ghetto, and it used to be almost like a cultural center because people were attracted by the fact that my mother and father were creative people. So, the groups like Ladysmith Black Mambazo, they would come in the 60s to my home to chill out and practice their craft because it was the safest place in a violent township because my dad was a feared man. So that's my background, yeah.
When did you start getting interested in art?
I started getting interested in art at a very early age. I would say from literally, I think whilst I was in my mother's womb, actually, when I'm not trying to be funny, because the first sense that develops in the human is the sense of hearing. And there was always drumming and dancing and singing going on in my community and in my home in particular. So that was my first experience. But as a child, I would follow the spiritual drummers, the Shembe drummers, who used to, on moonlit nights, parade through the township. And I would follow them, dancing to their drumming. They did spiritual drumming and chanting, and that used to totally captivate me. And then the singing under the fig trees and the jazz musicians who used to come to my home and the poets and painters. So in my very early life, I was exposed to all kinds of art forms. Yeah. And I knew that, and when I went to school, even at primary school, I used to have an interest in painting. I started, painting, drawing pictures and stuff like that. Possibly even before I became interested in music. So the visual arts are quite deeply embedded in my psyche in that sense.
Are you doing any projects now?
Yes, I have several projects going on at the same time in different parts of the world. One of them is called the Quartet of Peace. And it's called the Quartet of Peace because South Africa has 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners who are Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Tutu, the former President F.W. de Klerk, and the long-dead Dr. Albert Luthuli, who was one of the early ANC founding members. And a violin maker in South Africa called Brian Lysis has made 4 instruments for a string quartet, 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello, and each of them is named after and dedicated to each of the 4 Nobel Peace Laureates of South Africa. I've written a composition called Uxolo, which is the Zulu or Xhosa word for forgiveness and peace. And it's the first piece of music that was composed specifically for those 4 instruments. And the project goes around the world to places where young people in particular have been affected by violence or, brutality of one kind or another. And that's the Quartet of Peace. That's one of my projects. Another is I have a charity called Umoya Creations, and I use music to in places where there's been conflict, like in South Africa, like in Bosnia, in Sudan, and places like that, to inspire young people to take their creativity by their own hands, if you like, and determine their own futures.
Does your background have any effect on your work?
Yeah, my background has a very great effect on my work, particularly because my background informs my work in one main sense, and that is to not feel hindered or trapped or imprisoned by the difference in art forms and difference between cultures. Because I come from a background of apartheid, where we were oppressed because of our color by the apartheid regime, the racist regime, I'm ever so alert in my own creativity to be open-armed and embracing and welcoming to not only other people of different cultural background and ethnicity and whatever than myself, but also welcoming towards any kind of art form. So I dabble, in all the art forms, really.
How did you find out about the Brixton Art Gallery?
In the 80s, in the early 80s, I was very poor and squatting on Brixton Road. And I also I started running music workshops at the Oval House Theatre near the Oval Cricket Ground. And through those connections, I heard about the Brixton Art Collective, the gallery there, but also because I frequented the market and I was aware of what was going on, in the arches. It was like an extension of my own community. And in this year, I'm forgetting the year now, I think it was 83 or whatever it was, but in the early 80s, when I say we, myself and other South African exiles like myself were formed into a group called Pitso, which in one of our South African languages means a coming together, calling together, like a forum for exchanging ideas and discussing. Pitso created an exhibition when we were invited by the Brixton Art Collective to do something there. We created an exhibition that ran for a few weeks, and it was called Monti Wa Marumo, which means Boomerang to the Source. And I guess it was an opportunity for us to express our collective longing to be within a culture where we can come together and share our experiences freely through the use of the arts. And as I said earlier, that we were coming from a culture that did not have compartments, like barriers or walls between the various art forms. So when we took over the Brixton Art Gallery, we had painters, we had sculptors, we had musicians, we had dancers, we had poets, we had writers, and we also had food. And so for all of those 3 weeks, if I'm remembering correctly, we stayed up, morning and night, and we made food, and the vibe was just a creative vibe. And I'll never forget a very powerful experience that happened. The windows were always, clear and open. And one day, two Jamaican women, pulling, those little two-wheel trolleys that old women use to go to the market. They were shopping, in the Brixton market. And they suddenly got drawn to the gallery because in the window were exhibited sculptures by my friend Bitigantuli, with whom we set up the exhibition. And the sculptures were were either in wood or they were in junk, like old motor car silencers and exhaust pipes and stuff like that, And they were of human beings, they were like creatures, human creatures, if you like, in writhing in pain and also in celebration. And these women were drawn and they came to the windows, and I can't imitate the the Jamaican sort of speak, the patois they were speaking in, but basically they were saying, gosh, the white man makes beautiful things. When I saw them being attracted, I came outside, to invite them in. I could tell that they were curious and intrigued. And when I got to them with their trolley and their bags, they said, gosh, the white man makes the most beautiful things, don't they? And then I said, no, Mom, these aren't the white men. This is not the white man who did this. This is made by a black man from Africa, And they said, yeah. And they'd never been to an exhibition before. And then I brought them in. They came inside, and on the floor there were paper. There was paper with kids doing artwork. We're running workshops there, like art. Workshops were happening at the same time. And I'd made, and standing behind the kids, in and amongst the sculptures, was a wooden marimba that I'd made, like a xylophone. And I'd made it with some young people in one of my projects at Oval House, where we collected junk from skips and made the instrument, it stood up like that. And underneath, the resonators were like carpet tubing, And we had beaters. And these women, one of my friends was jamming on this when the women came in. And then they wanted to play. They took their bags off and they took sticks, the beaters, and played. And that for me was one of the most phenomenal, high points in the whole exhibition, because the exhibition had attracted people from the community, the users of the market and local people who wouldn't normally go to an art gallery. It wasn't part of their scene. It wasn't what they did naturally. And so from that point of view, it was a very successful exhibition, and lots more happened.
What are your memories of the Brixton Art Gallery shows and the collective?
My memories of the Brixton Art Gallery shows and the collective are principally of a collective of people who had an energy that is not matched in anything that I see now, and an enthusiasm and a creative sort of urgency and need to express, themselves that was very vital. And very captivating. Very open people. People were open to sharing ideas. There was no, there wasn't a sort of negative sense of one culture or ethnic group dominating another, or one art form dominating another. It was a very buzzy, very exciting place. Place I used to just go there sometimes even long after our exhibition, and as the gallery stayed open, I would just go there, on an odd day, sometimes not to see the art, but just to go to be part of a dynamic community.
When did you move to England?
I moved from South Africa to England in 1980, in June 1980. I remember that distinctly. And I was forced to leave my country because of my cultural and political activities. I was one of the young people who was critical of the way the apartheid government treated black people. And it got to a point where my life was under threat. And I happened to like myself because I still have stories to tell and I wanted to remain in one piece. So I fled the country, like many people of my generation did. And I landed in England, and I lived first for a while. I squatted on St Agnes Place in Kennington, near the 12 Tribes house, where Bob Marley actually used to go when he came to London. And then shortly after that, I found a squat on Brixton Road, and then eventually a council flat. And I've been living in England ever since. And I'm happy to be here, not least of all because being here has given me the opportunity to express myself and share my stories. And as I'm saying that, I remember that there's a story you might be interested in hearing. In the 1980s and early 90s, I used to be the musician for a Guyanese poet called John Agard. John Agard is a very witty poet who's a friend of Linton Kwesi Johnson's and Benjamin Zephaniah and people like that. And I used to be the musician for him. He'd come over from Lewes, where he lives, near Brighton and Hastings, and he would come to London, stay in my flat overnight, and then the next morning we'd take a train, to wherever in England we were going to perform, So he'd come in the night, I'd make dinner for him, and we'd chill out and we'd discuss the poetry. We'd have a little jam session. I had a piano and flute and marimba. And on this particular morning, we are traveling from London to some outlying place, in the outskirts somewhere. And we at one of those, we're in at Euston Station, I think. And John is in the queue buying tickets for us. And I'm weighed down, with all my instruments, my djembe drum, my shakers, a bag full of, little goodies, percussion goodies, and this Ghanaian African marimba xylophone, with like a bridge of notes. And then the resonators under the instrument are gourds, like calabashes, a bit like a goat's udders, under the instrument. And I'm carrying it on my shoulder and waiting at the busy station at rush hour. A woman comes to me and she's quite racist and she insults me. I don't remember exactly what she says, but all I remember was that she was very rude towards me and starts to become interested in my instruments. And she's meant to be in the queue as well. And she just takes off and, calls me some funny things, and I get upset. I look away, I take a deep breath, and I do my yogic breathing. I used to do lots of yoga then, and I just relax and chill out rather than get angry and aggressive towards her. She doesn't stop though. She takes an interest in the instrument, and she says, "Where is it from?" And I tell her, and I tell her where I'm from and that I'm Zulu, And then she wants to know what it sounds like. And then I decide to myself that I'm going to use the music to chill her out, So I take off all my things and I put the marimba on the floor at the station. It's busy, as I said. And I start to play this groove, I just play some nice music. And the music is so lyrical and mellifluous, so sweet, like honey. She's totally, taken by it. And the entire station comes to a standstill, because if you know Euston Station, it's cavernous, and the acoustic for that kind of thing, for the voice and, marimba type music is phenomenal. The whole station just stops and my music just spreads through the whole place. And when I finish playing, people applaud and you can tell that they like it. The woman says, "I can't believe it," and I say, "What are you talking about?" She says, "You can't be Zulu." And I say, "What do you mean? I'm Zulu. How are you telling me, And she says, "No, Zulu people are aggressive. They are warlike, they are warriors. How can you play such sweet music? How can this instrument come from your culture and you play such sweet music, And, I left her to make up her own mind, and that's the end of the story.
What was the contribution of the Brixton Art Gallery experience to your own life?
The contribution of the Brixton Art Gallery experience to my own life is almost immeasurable, and I'm not trying to be dramatic or extreme in saying that. For someone like myself, coming from being brutalized by a racist regime such as obtained in South Africa when I grew up, the one thing that I was looking for, and that my fellow South African exiles were looking for, was a place they could call home, from home, if you like, So for me, in every conceivable sense, the Brixton Art Gallery was like a home from home for me, until I met the people, at the Brixton Art Gallery. Until I came across the Brixton Art Gallery, I was, in sort of limbo, just floating about, not knowing where to root myself. And the Brixton Art Gallery gave me a very, very strong sense of being rooted, of being amongst family, if you like, of being amongst a community that did not relate to me in a way that was prejudiced, that was open to me and open to my difference. It was a place where, as I might have mentioned earlier, where people of different backgrounds could come and be together without fear of persecution or being judged in any sort of counterproductive or negative way. So it contributed a lot to my life. And another thing I'm just thinking of as I speak is I have a daughter called Monti Skeef. She is a famous musician and a singer. She lives in Brixton, and she was a little kid in those days. And very often I would take her to the Brixton Art Gallery just so that she could be there amongst, creative people and people who would remind her of the kind of people she, left behind in South Africa. And that inspired her and inspired her music career, I would say.